we learn in the 90s? Ratings were not measured by analysis of whether Saddam Hussein actually possessed chemical weapons. No, something more was needed to compete against ESPN or MTV or the must-see TV of the networks. Drama. Drama drove ratings. Urgency drove ratings. Countdown clocks to war drove ratings. Today is different. When Tucker Carlson interviewed Scott Horton for 2 hours about the history of American intervention in the Middle East, walking through the 1953 Iranian coup, the support for Saddam Hussein in the 1980s, the backing of jihadists in Afghanistan and later Syria, that conversation reaches millions of people. This is the conversation that cable news cannot have. Not 4-minute segments with 6 people talking over each other. 2 hours. Primary sources. Historical context. The actual complexity of how American foreign policy developed and what interests it served.
Welcome to the Consequential Actions podcast, where we aim to learn how history impacts current events and affects our lives today through the lens of politics, the economy, technology, and business trends. I may be an AI, but your host, well, he is not artificial in any way. Here is Jeff Kellick.
In 1897, William Randolph Hearst reportedly sent a telegram to his illustrator in Cuba. The artist had written that the situation was calm. There was no war to cover. Hearst's response has become legend. You furnish the pictures, and I will furnish the war. The quotation may be apocryphal. The dynamic it describes was entirely real. Hearst's New York Journal and Joseph Pulitzer's New York World were locked in a circulation war. Sensationalism sold papers. Atrocity stories, real, embellished, or invented, sold more. And nothing sold papers like the drums of war. By February 1898, when the USS Maine exploded in Havana Harbor, the American public had been primed. Months of lurid coverage. Spanish atrocities against Cuban civilians. Tales of brutality designed to inflame. They had done their work. The journal blamed Spain within hours. Remember the Maine! To hell with Spain! Became the rallying cry. The evidence? There was none. Modern analysis strongly suggests it was an internal coal bunker fire. But Hearst and Pulitzer had already furnished the war. Now consider March 2003. Americans had been primed for intervention in Iraq by months of coverage amplifying administration claims about weapons of mass destruction. Aluminum tubes, yellow cake uranium, mushroom clouds as smoking guns. The New York Times published, the Washington Post repeated. Cable news counted down to shock and awe. They had graphics packages and retired generals providing color commentary. The weapons? They did not exist. Years later, the mea culpas arrived, the editor's notes, the we got it wrong retrospectives. But then something interesting happened. The audiences began to leave. Today, cable news ratings are in long-term decline. The median Fox News viewer is 69 years old. CNN and MSNBC skew older. Fox averages about 1.5 million primetime viewers. The CNN struggles to even get 500,000. But Americans have not stopped consuming the news. They've not stopped looking for commentary. No. They've migrated to YouTube, to Spotify, to podcasts, to streaming platforms where voices that could not get airtime on cable news now reach audiences larger than cable ever delivered. Joe Rogan averages 11 to 14 million listeners per episode. That's more than all cable news combined on any given night. And Tucker Carlson? His streaming shows draw larger audiences than his Fox News program ever did. His interview with Vladimir Putin garnered over 20 million views just on YouTube. The anti-imperialists of 1898 had Mark Twain, Andrew Carnegie, William Graham Sumner, and they had eloquent arguments. But what they did not have was distribution. The yellow press controlled the information environment, and no alternative existed at scale. Today, distribution has been decentralized. It's been democratized. The gatekeepers have lost their gates. And the audience, the American public, you get to choose. And what are you choosing? That's today's question. I am Jeff Kellick, and this is the Consequential Actions Podcast. This is episode 3, part B of the series, Empire of Liberty, America's Foreign Entanglements from the Founders to the Forever Wars. Today, you furnish the pictures, yellow journalism, and the great media migration. As with all Tuesday episodes, this is a contemporary application. We connect the patterns we examined last Saturday on the Spanish-American War to the media landscape of our own time. We'll examine how the commercial logic that drove yellow journalism in 1898 persists in legacy media today, why audiences are migrating to alternative platforms, and what this means for the anti-interventionist voice that was marginalized then, but is finding its audience now. This episode may be a bit longer than usual because the subject demands it. So bear with me. I hope we learn something, and I hope this matters. With that said, let us begin. In the 1890s in New York City, they hosted the most vicious newspaper competition in American history. William Randolph Hearst had purchased the New York Journal in 1895, specifically to challenge Joseph Pulitzer's New York World. Both men understood something fundamental about the news business. Readers buy drama. They buy outrage. And they buy stories that make them feel. Peace is boring. A Spanish colonial administrator efficiently managing Cuban plantations, that doesn't sell papers. But tales of Spanish soldiers herding Cuban women and children into reconcentration camps filled with disease and starvation, of colonial brutality, that sells papers. The irony, of course, is much of that was true. And General Weyler's reconcentration policy did kill an estimated 100,000 to 400,000 Cuban civilians. The yellow press did not need to invent atrocities. Spain was committing real ones. But accuracy was not the point. Circulation was the point. Hearst and Pulitzer deployed innovations we now take for granted. Large headlines, dramatic illustrations, human interest stories, relentless day after day after day coverage that made the Cuban crisis feel like the most important story in the world, requiring immediate American action. The commercial incentive was pretty straightforward. More readers meant more advertising revenue. More advertising revenue meant more resources to hire talent, buy equipment, expand distribution. The journal's circulation approached 1 million during the crisis, unprecedented numbers that made Hearst enormously wealthy. When the main exploded, Neither Hearst nor Pulitzer waited for evidence. The Journal offered a $50,000 reward for information proving the explosion was not an accident, essentially announcing their editorial conclusion before any investigation even began. Both papers blamed Spain immediately, completely, and relentlessly. Now consider what dissenting voices faced in this environment. The Anti-Imperialist League had prominent members, former presidents, industrialists, respected writers. But they had no distribution mechanism to match the yellow press. Mark Twain's most bitter anti-imperial satires went unpublished during his lifetime. The War Prayer, his devastating critique of war enthusiasm, was deemed too controversial. His publisher rejected it. Twain reportedly said, "Only dead men can tell the truth in this world." William Graham Sumner could write essays. Andrew Carnegie could give speeches. Senator Hoare could make his arguments on the Senate floor. But none of this reached the breakfast tables of ordinary Americans the way Hearst headlines did. The commercial logic created structural asymmetry. War fever sold papers. Careful analysis of whether intervention served American interests did not sell papers. The economic incentives pointed one direction and the coverage followed. The Spanish-American War was 1898. 105 years later, we did it again. The Iraq War is the most documented media failure in modern American history. Not because the dynamics were hidden, they were obvious to anyone paying attention, but because the principal actors had since admitted what's happened. In 2004, the New York Times published an editor's note acknowledging the coverage was not as rigorous as it should have been. Articles by Judith Miller and others had uncritically repeated administration claims about weapons of mass destruction, aluminum tubes, and Iraqi nuclear programs. Skeptical voices within the intelligence community had been ignored or buried. And the paper that sets the news agenda for American media had functioned simply as a megaphone for false claims that led to war. The Washington Post conducted its own review. Howard Kurtz reported that administration assertions were on the front page. The doubts were on A18. Stories questioning the case for war existed. They simply were not given prominence. And the structural incentive favored dramatic claims of imminent danger, not careful examination of whether or not those claims held up. But why did this happen? The same commercial logic that drove Hearst and Pulitzer was adapted for the cable news age. Let us look back at the first Gulf War, 1991, Operation Desert Storm. Those of us who are old enough to remember can recall sitting around the TV with our families or friends watching the war unfold real time in CNN. I don't think I ever even turned the channel in that late January timeframe of 1991. It was on CNN constantly. The world changed, of course. But so did the business of cable news. CNN was founded in 1980, but it was the Gulf War that really put it on the map. Everyone that had cable was tuned into CNN. And if you didn't have cable, you went to a friend's house that did. Or this was what prompted you to finally make the switch and purchase your own cable box. It was that important to have. And the cable bonanza soon created demand for more offerings. MSNBC and then Fox News would both be launched to compete with CNN in 1996. Thus, with this in mind, consider the business model of cable news in 2002 and 2003. Networks competed for ratings. Higher ratings meant higher advertising rates. What drove ratings? What did we learn in the 90s? Ratings were not measured by analysis of whether Saddam Hussein actually possessed chemical weapons. No, something more was needed to compete against ESPN or MTV or the must-see TV of the networks. Drama. Drama drove ratings. Urgency drove ratings. Countdown clocks to war drove ratings. CNN experienced its highest ratings in years during the invasion. The visual spectacle of shock and awe, the night vision footage, the embedded reporters advancing with military units. This was television at its most compelling. Peace? Peace doesn't look like anything on television. But war is visually spectacular. And then there was the access trap. Access to information. And this compounded the problem. Beat journalists, beat reporters depend on official sources for information. A journalist who accurately reported that the intelligence did not support administration claims would then find their access restricted, limited. Sources would stop returning calls. But competitors with a more cooperative relationship, they would get the scoop. And you had anonymous sourcing. Quote, a senior administration official. This allowed people to make dramatic claims without any accountability. If the claim proved false, who was responsible? Not the official who made it anonymously. Not the reporter who printed it without verification. It was the reader, it was the public who were left holding the bag. And who appeared on cable news to analyze the march to war? Former generals, former CIA officials, former State Department personnel. The very people who designed American foreign policy were now presented as the neutral analysts evaluating it. A 2008 New York Times investigation revealed that many of these military analysts had been receiving Pentagon talking points and coaching their commentary to support administration objectives. The term for this is manufacturing consent. The phrase comes from Walter Lippmann back in 1922, more popularized by Noam Chomsky and Herman in 1988. The media does not simply report on government policy, it creates conditions under which citizens accept government policy as legitimate and necessary. In a later episode in this series, we'll discuss the declassified Operation Mockingbird, which was uncovered during the Church Committee hearings, and how the CIA manipulated the media, the New York Times, the Washington Post, all to drive opinion on war and other programs during the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and how that likely continued even after being exposed into the late 20th century and possibly even to today. But even beyond covert manipulation, we must see the patterns as they played out. As students of history, as contemporary readers, as consumers of the news media, there's a pattern we must recognize. The Iraq War, we got it wrong. Libya, 2011. The responsibility to protect intervention. That transformed a functioning state into a failed state that has open slave markets. Media coverage at the time presented humanitarian intervention as urgent and necessary. Of course, now we acknowledge that that intervention created an even worse humanitarian catastrophe. Syria, the moderate rebels who turned out to be not so moderate. The chemical weapons red line. Coverage consistently presented regime change both as achievable and desirable without seriously examining what comes after. And what came after? A former al-Qaeda terrorist is now propped up as the president of the Syrian regime, one that has personal access to the White House, unbelievably. In each case, it's the same cycle: crisis framing, uncritical amplification of official claims, and marginalization of skeptical voices. Then you have intervention, and then you have a post-hoc acknowledgement of the failure. But there's no structural change. And there's no partisan difference either. We're talking about both Bush's administrations, the Clinton administration, Obama, Biden, Trump. It doesn't matter the R or the D by the name. It just repeats. And the question should not be whether individual journalists are good people. Many are. No. The question is what the commercial structure incentivizes. If war coverage drives ratings and access to official sources require cooperative framing, then the system selects for coverage that supports war, supports bombing, and the more soft term, intervention, regardless of whatever individual journalists might personally believe. And the Overton window on this, the window of acceptable foreign policy debate on cable news, ran from "we should intervene now" to all the way to, well, we should intervene slightly later with more international support. The anti-interventionist forces, those voices, they weren't refuted. They were simply not platformed. And whenever they were labeled as isolationist or Putin apologist or Assad toady, whatever that means. They were dismissed by name calling or marginalized rather than engaged on substance. Something changed. The audiences left. Not all at once, not dramatically, but steadily, inexorably. The numbers tell a story that the legacy media cannot ignore. Let me give you some of that data. In 2020, Tucker Carlson averaged 4.3 million viewers per night. It was the highest rated program in cable news history. When Fox News dismissed Carlson in April 23, the APM hour immediately dropped 21%, and the networks never recovered that audience. Where did they go? Carlson launched a streaming show on X and his own network. His interview with Vladimir Putin garnered over 20 million views in the first week. And he has other interviews. His interview with Scott Horton, a libertarian foreign policy scholar whose anti-interventionist analysis spans decades, represents exactly the kind of substantial, long-form discussion that cable news cannot accommodate. But Carlson's not an isolated case. He's part of a broader migration. Joe Rogan averages 11 to 14 million listeners per episode. To put that in perspective, that's roughly 28 times CNN's primetime audience. On a single episode, Rogan reaches more Americans than CNN reaches in an entire week. His interview with Donald Trump before the 2024 election drew over 50 million views on YouTube alone. His platform has become, for a significant portion of the American public, the primary venue for long-form discussion. Megyn Kelly left Fox News, then NBC. Her podcast now consistently ranks in the top news podcasts on Spotify and Apple and others. Piers Morgan's YouTube channel draws millions of views per episode. The audience did not disappear. The audience moved. Now consider what this means for the voices that legacy media previously excluded. Give one example of Dave Smith. He's a comedian, a libertarian commentator. On cable news, he'd be dismissed, if he was even platformed at all. He'd be dismissed as unqualified to discuss foreign policy. He's not a former general. He's not a former CIA official. He's never worked at the State Department. But on podcasts, Smith has spent years making detailed arguments about American foreign policy, about the consequences of intervention, about the disconnect between official narratives and documented outcomes. He's debated neoconservatives and held his own because he came prepared with facts and sources. In April this year, Joe Rogan hosted a debate between Smith and Douglas Murray. Murray's a British commentator, conservative, who supports interventionist foreign policy, a mainstay of the legacy media. What happens illustrates the difference between legacy media discourse and the new environment. Murray's critique of Smith was not on substance. He did not demonstrate that Smith's historical claims were wrong. Instead, Murray repeatedly attacked Smith's credentials. You are a comedian. You have never been to Israel. You are not an expert. This is the credentialing gatekeep. The argument is not that the analysis is wrong. The argument is the person making the analysis lacks the proper stamps of approval from establishment institutions. But here's what the legacy media does not understand. The audience watched that debate. They could see that Murray was deflecting rather than responding. They could see that when Smith cited specific events, specific documents, specific outcomes, Murray changed the subject to Smith's lack of credentials. The audience is not stupid. The audience can evaluate arguments when given the opportunity to hear them in full. And Smith clearly won the debate on substance. Murray attempted to minimize Smith's clear knowledge advantage on the subjects as inconsequential because Smith's background was untraditional, never considering that the only qualification required to debate was an ability to read, to understand logic, to evaluate the patterns of history, and apply that learned knowledge to current policy. That is what they were supposed to debate: substance, logic, and establishment incentive structures versus what's in the interest of the people, not personal resumes. Glenn Greenwald won a Pulitzer Prize for his reporting on the NSA surveillance while at The Guardian. He co-founded The Intercept. When his work became too critical of establishment narratives, he left. Now he publishes on Substack and Rumble, reaching audiences who want journalism that challenges power rather than amplifying it. Matt Taibbi built his reputation in Rolling Stone. His coverage of the Twitter files, documenting government coordination with social media platforms to suppress certain viewpoints, found its home also on Substack, after legacy publications showed no interest. And on the left, the Young Turks, whatever one thinks of their perspective, represents a left-leaning alternative to corporate media that has built an audience outside the traditional structures. The pattern is consistent. Journalists and commentators who challenge establishment consensus on foreign policy, who ask uncomfortable questions about the interests served by intervention, who treat official claims with skepticism rather than deference. These voices either get pushed out of legacy media or choose to leave. And when they do, they often find larger audiences than they had before. The gatekeepers have lost their gates. Let's return briefly to 1898 and the Anti-Imperialist League. They had Mark Twain, perhaps the most famous writer in America. They had Andrew Carnegie, the richest man in the country. They had Grover Cleveland, a former president. They had Samuel Gompers, the most influential labor leader. They had senators, academics, ministers, and they lost. Not because their arguments were weak. Their arguments were prophetic. They predicted that empire would corrupt Republican government. They predicted that occupying the Philippines would require the same brutalities America condemned Spain for using. They predicted that commercial interests would drag the nation into entanglements that served narrow interests while imposing costs on the broader public. They were right about everything. And they lost because the information environment was controlled by interests aligned against them. The yellow press shaped what ordinary Americans believed about Cuba, about Spain, about the necessity of intervention. Alternative viewpoints existed, but they could not achieve scale. Today is different. When Tucker Carlson interviewed Scott Horton for 2 hours about the history of American intervention in the Middle East, walking through the 1953 Iranian coup, the support for Saddam Hussein in the 1980s, the backing of jihadists in Afghanistan and later Syria, that conversation reaches millions of people. This is the conversation that cable news cannot have. Not 4-minute segments with 6 people talking over each other. 2 hours. Primary sources. Historical context. The actual complexity of how American foreign policy developed and what interests it served. Horton's argument, documented across multiple books and thousands of articles, is that American intervention consistently produces blowback. That the terrorism we fight today grew from interventions we pursued yesterday. That the commercial and ideological interests driving intervention are not the same as the national interests of the American people. Whether one agrees with every element of this analysis is not the point. The point is that the analysis can now reach an audience. The argument can be made at length with evidence to millions of people who can then evaluate it for themselves. This is what the Anti-Imperialist League could not do. This is what Mark Twain could not do when publishers rejected the war prayer. The technology has changed the game. Now, I don't want to overstate the case. The new media environment has its own problems. Alternative platforms have their own commercial incentives. Engagement-driven algorithms can reward inflammatory content. Echo chambers form. Not every independent voice is rigorous. Quality varies enormously. Legacy media still sets the official narrative, the narrative that policymakers reference. When the president gives a speech, cable news covers it. When alternative voices challenge that speech, they are speaking to their audiences, not the Situation Room. And the establishment has not given up. The credential and gatekeep that Douglas Murray deployed against Dave Smith, "You are not the expert," remains a primary weapon. The implication is that only people with approved credentials from approved institutions should discuss foreign policy. Everyone else should defer. But the audience is no longer deferring. Trust in mainstream media sites sits at historic lows. Repeated failures, WMDs, Russian collusion, COVID coverage that shifted with the political winds. These have eroded the presumption that official sources tell the truth. The migration is not because Americans stopped wanting information. The migration is because Americans started wanting different information than what legacy media would provide. And in that migration, the anti-interventionist tradition that was marginalized in 1898, that was marginalized in 2003, is finding a new distribution mechanism. William Graham Sumner wrote that Spain conquered the United States in 1898, that America adopted the imperial practices it claimed to oppose. Scott Horton makes essentially the same argument about the war on terror. The continuity of the critique spans more than a century. The difference is that today, the critique can reach its audience. What have we established today? The commercial logic that drove yellow journalism in 1898 persists in legacy media. War is dramatic. Peace is boring. Access to official sources require cooperative framing. The structural incentives push coverage toward intervention, regardless of whether intervention serves the national interest. The Iraq War demonstrated that this system could lead America into catastrophic error. The weapons did not exist. The liberation did not materialize. The cost in lives and treasure exceeded all projections. And the media that amplified the case for war largely escaped accountability. But the audience noticed. Trust collapsed, and technology provided an exit. The great migration from cable news to streaming, from network broadcasts to podcasts, represents something more than a shift in consumption habits. It represents an opportunity for voices the legacy media excluded to now find their audience at scale. The anti-imperialists of 1898 had arguments but no distribution. The anti-interventionists of 2026 have both. This is not guaranteed victory. The interests that benefit from intervention, commercial, ideological, institutional, remain powerful. They adapt, they co-opt, they deploy new strategies to marginalize dissent. But the information environment has fundamentally changed. The gatekeepers have lost their monopoly. And the audience gets to choose. Next Sunday, Article 4. We're going to examine the Great Game and the road to Armageddon. How imperial competition that began with 1898 contributed to the catastrophe of World War I, and how the patterns established then echo in great power competition today. And then on Tuesday, we'll continue our contemporary application series, examining another aspect of the themes we have discussed. I am Jeff Kellick, and this has been episode 3B of the Empire of Liberty, America's Foreign Entanglements from the Founders to the Forever Wars on the Consequential Action podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode and want to follow the series, please subscribe to our Substack page at consequentialactions.com. Here you'll find all written articles, as well as our previous series on the General Welfare Clause and the New Leviathan. You'll also get early access to both Saturday episodes and Tuesday episodes a day early on Substack, so you can get them on Monday and Friday. Also, it helps, and please do, subscribe to our YouTube channel at Consequential Action Podcast. Here you'll find the full video versions of all podcast episodes and an easy way to consume them on your smart TV, on your phone, on your computer. And follow me on X at jkellick for updates, discussions, and announcements. We'll continue to post articles and welcome your participation. Until next time, have a great day.